Welcome everybody today to the Merowith Center program, Who Wrote the 5 Books of Moses, Part 2. And we welcome Sheldon and his wonderful presentation and giving us so much information. Sheldon, thank you so much for being with us today and everyone else. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Okay. Last week, we talked about the hypothesis in terms of who wrote the text, when it was written. This week, we're going to actually look at the text, a couple of stories I think you'll know, and try to apply some of the learning and some of the concepts that we talked about last week. So if you would, let's put the first slide up. Okay. Judy?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay. You'll recall this scripture timeline in terms of identifying the various authors of the text that were layered into a consolidated text by what most scholars believe was Ezra in the 5th century of the BCE, based on writings that started perhaps around 1000 and earlier with the J scribes, and then ultimately E, etc. And the key in terms of identifying both when this book was written, the scribes did their writing, and who they were based upon the evolution of Hebrew as a language. Like English, over a 500 or 600 year period, English changed dramatically. The English of Shakespeare is dramatically different than the English that was used in the United States in the 17th century or the 18th century, and certainly the English that is used today. So scholars have been pretty well able to determine who wrote this, when the texts were written, and who the writers were based upon the distinctive style that each writer used. So we know that the P text, which is the P scribes, largely influenced by Ezekiel. So we can compare the writings in terms of the book of Ezekiel with text written by P, which was largely in terms of throughout the book, but certainly in terms of the book of Leviticus. There's comparability, and similarly with D, we can match the writing in the book of Jeremiah with D. And there are other people who were part of their scribes and who work for them who further that activity on. So we can pretty well identify, or scholars can really particularly identify the authorship, when it was written, and therefore can determine pretty well when the texts were written. Next slide, please. We talked about the style of writing. They weren't writing history. They weren't writing newspaper comments in terms of what was going on. They were writing allegory. They were use of metaphors. So both people and places were metaphorical. Therefore, the story, there are 2 levels of the story. The surface level, which is the characters in terms of what was going on, and on a symbolic level, in terms of what the authors were trying to say based upon the events in that time period, using those symbolic characters. And to get to that in terms of what we call critical source analysis of the biblical text, it requires some hypothesis, which is making some assumptions. None of this can be proven. It is a matter of scholarly opinion in terms of is what the text meant. Let's advance it, please. Next slide. So we're going to talk about 3 stories, essentially, today. And I suggested you might want to refer to the biblical text to follow the stories. although I'm going to read it to the story, basically the story, part of the story that I want you to hear, you may choose and want to follow the story. That's entirely up to you. So let's talk about why there are two names for the God of Israel. Okay, Yud Hey Vav Hey, or which is frequently in English in your text will be referred to Lord. Okay. Some people call Yud Hey Vav Hey to protect the sacredness of the name Adonai. Same thing. So the second name frequently used for God throughout the text is Elohim. Okay. So we're going to how did this, why two names? Okay. So if you want to follow the text in terms of one, you might want to find Exodus 6.2. 6.2. Okay. Next slide, please. And I'll give you a chance to get there. Next slide, please. So why do the patriarchs have a different name for God? Okay. I'm going to start the reading at 6.2 through 4. And it's entirely up to you if you want to follow the reading. Placing. Moses is now in Egypt. He has followed God's commandment to take on Pharaoh, to get Pharaoh to let people go, the Hebrew slaves go. And the text says, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. That's the English translation for Yud Hey Vav Hey. I am Yud Hey Vav Hey. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by the name Yud Hey Vav Hey, okay, Adonai. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Okay. Stop at that point. Next bullet, please. So the question is, why would God not have made himself known to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, by the name Yahweh? Next bullet. Why would God create a fictitious name, El Shaddai, by which the patriarchs came to know him, if his name was Yahweh? Is the disclosure of God's name a recognition that Moses enjoyed a special relationship with God that the patriarchs didn't, which is what some of the ancient biblical commentators suggested as the rationale for this difference in names? Or did God want to reward Moses for his undertaking this mission to challenge Pharaoh and therefore become more personal with him? Or does it signify a change in names to fit the new relationship that God would have with these Hebrews who had been enslaved? We'll see. Next slide, please. What we learn is it is more than a name change. Next, please. God previously introduced God's self to Moses in Midian when he as I am who I am, when Moses asked him, who else shall I tell the the Hebrew slaves sent me? God refused to tell him the name change at that point in time. All he would tell him is, I am who I am, go on. So why the change? Well, the reason is we have different authors. Next, please. Fact is, the deity, Yud Hey Vav Hey, had been unknown in Israel up to the Mosaic Revolution. So that raises the question, what deity was worshipped in Israel prior to the event in Egypt with God's disclosure to Moses? Next slide, please. So here's the references. Elohim, which is a plural form of the word El. Anytime you see I am at the end of the word, it means it's plural. Or El Shaddai, or El Elyon, or El Elohai Yisrael. These are all terms used in the biblical text as it deals with the patriarchs. They're not synonyms for Yod, He, Vav, He. So why use multiple names for the God of Israel? Biblical interpreters, those are the commentators like Rashi and Rashbam and Nachmanides, who studied text during the Middle Ages, said, well, it conveys different attributes of God: love versus justice. Some biblical interpreters asserted El as a generic name for God, and Yahweh as a specific name of Israel's gods. Readers have assumed that the various references of El were just another way of saying or identifying Israel's God. Next slide, please. Both the E and P sources of the text report that until Yahweh revealed his name to Moses, the name of this deity was unknown. God was worshipped under the name of El Shaddai, El Elyon, Elohim, and the rabbinic interpretation where they uses different epithets for the name of Israel's God, that he's always been their God, only under a different name. Next, please. So the commentator's traditional explanation is that El Shaddai or Elohim, when it's used in the text, means, Judy, that the patriarchs needed a nurturing God, a parent-child relationship. His presence was known initially through intermediaries. And so therefore, El Shaddai or Elohim reflects God, the attribute of God as a God of justice. On the other hand, they said Yahweh had a different relationship because Moses had a different relationship. It was a more mature relationship. He was the only prophet that God spoke to face with on numerous occasions, and therefore it was the attribute of God toward Moses and towards the Israelites at that point became one of compassion. Okay, so at least some unanswered questions. If this is the same God that Moses is introduced to, and is the same God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, why does God change his name? What was he doing on a mountaintop in Midian, southeast of Canaan, where the patriarchs had resided? Why is the mountaintop in Midian referred to as the mountain of God? That's where Moses first met this God as he was herding sheep. He went to a mountain that was called the Mountain of God, and there, sure enough, that's where he first encountered Yahweh. What happened to the God that Jacob experienced that he resided at Bethel, which is in Canaan? Jacob had this experience where he was lying on the rock, sleeping, and he saw a ladder extended up to the sky, angels going up, and he realized, and according to text, that this must be the home of God. It was in Canaan. It wasn't in Midian. So why is the name of Abraham's God Elohim in the plural form? Because Elohim is a plural of the word El. If God is one, why would we refer to as Elohim? So in 1960, a group of archaeologists digging in Syria, just north of Israel, had some specific findings in a place called Laodicea. Next bullet, please. They discovered texts written in the Ugaritic language. And the Ugaritic language was language that preceded in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. Hebrew was built on the Ugaritic language that parallels ancient Hebrew, that gives us insight into the Canaanite religion, the religion practiced by the Canaanites in this area of Syria. And what I also found is that there were psalms, and psalms were chanted in the ancient world as a part of the religious experience, both in Israel and in Canaan. And the psalms were almost identical one with the other. Next bullet point, please. The Canaanites worship a pantheon of gods known as Elohim. So now we have found out why Elohim. It's a pantheon of gods, a group of gods that the Canaanites worshipped. Next, please. And the names were El Shaddai, God Almighty, El Elyon. El was the leader of a pantheon of these Canaanites, and was referred to as he's strong as a bull. As a matter of fact, he was symbolized. This god was symbolized by a sculpture of the bull. Other gods in this pantheon included Asherah, El's wife, Astarte, his daughter, Baal Hadad, the storm god, Baal Haman, the god of fertility, Moloch, the god of fire, Shemayim, the god of, and on and on. It's an entire pantheon. And El was served by angels that did his bidding: Gabriel, Michael, Ariel, Raphael. These are Canaanites in God's, okay? Would you move back one moment? Okay. So let me just sit down. There was one other point. The Baals are El's sons. Baal was viewed, it was thought of as so far removed from humankind that they couldn't reach him. But the only way you could reach Baal is by worshiping El. The only way you could reach the main god was through the Baals, and the Baals were symbolized by calves. So you have the bull symbolizing El, and the Baals symbolized by calves. Okay. Next slide, please. Another finding gives us some interesting insights, and this is in Egypt, called the Merneptah stele, because it is a monument that was built during the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah. Is an ancient slab of stone describing Merneptah's conquests from Libya to what was Libya today, all the way up to Eastern Turkey, which was the empire of the Hittites. And among those conquests was a group of people living in Israel in the 13th century BCE who identified themselves as Israelites. They were living somewhere in the northern part of what was then called Canaan. What's interesting, though, is it's a period of time when the Hebrews, according to the biblical text, were enslaved in Egypt. So who are these Israelites that is in the land and not taken into slavery? And this group of Israelites were worshiping a god with the name of El. There are other Egyptian references, not in the Merneptah stele, but ever scrolls that identify people living in Edom and Midian, which is south and east of Israel and Judah, east of the Jordan River, worshiping a god named Yahweh. So the hypothesis of scholars is that a Yahweh worshiping people from the southeast, what is today northwest Saudi Arabia, worshiping merged with these Canaanites in the north, who were worshiping El, and it's the treatise is called the Midianite Hypothesis. This group of people, according to the Midianite Hypothesis, were this mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. And our text tells us that the farmer slaves came up on the east side of the Jordan River. So the Bible's dark secret is that the majority of people that became Israel had been Canaanites. They were never in Egypt. They had never been enslaved. Several Canaanite tribes formed an alliance for mutual defense that they called Israel. Next point. They were in the land during the Exodus, and they formed an Israelite confederation a century before the Exodus occurred. The emergence of this mixed multitude out of Egypt began a transformation process. Part of the hypothesis is that the Levites were part of this group, were the leaders of this group. And when you read the story of the Exodus, all of the players are identified as Levites: Moses, Aaron, Hur, etc. Joshua, all identified as Levites. Okay, so most scholars believe the Levites were the group that was in slavery, and there probably were others that joined them. That's the mixed multitude. Okay, so we're going to now talk about the story of Abraham being tested, the binding of Isaac, a story that really most of us all know. It's a very frightening story, a very difficult story to read. So I'm going to read that text with you. If you would like, please locate it, and we'll read it together. So in Genesis 22, 1 through 19. So you might want to follow. So sometime afterwards, God, and the word for God in this text is Elohim. And I'm just going to read the Hebrew word for the names of God. Sometime afterwards, Elohim put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favorite son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early in the morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place for which Elohim had told him. On the third day, Abraham looked up, saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, you stay here with this ass. The boy and I will go up here. We will worship, and we will return to you. Abraham then took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the two walked together. Then Isaac said to his father, Abraham, Father? And he answered, yes, my son. And he said, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, Elohim will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And the two of them walked together. They arrived at the place which Elohim had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then an angel of Yahweh, Yod He Vav, an angel of Yod He Vav, called to him and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he answered, here I am. And he said, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. Now I know that you love me. Tough story. Abraham's early life was marked with many difficulties and hardships. God called Abraham, and Abraham responded, Hineni, I am here. God demanded that Abraham offered a test. Because as a son is Isaac, a test, the greatest test of his faith. God testing human beings is a common theme in biblical literature. Is fairly common to see what they're made of, determine their level of devotion, explains the suffering lives of human beings. But what God is testing Abraham for is never stated in this text. Next slide, please. When Abraham heard the voice of God tell him to sacrifice his son, he responded mechanically, without emotion, unquestioningly, dutifully to bring Isaac to the altar. They came to the place. God said to him, Abraham, and Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood. He bound Isaac, his son, put him on the altar on the top of the wood, put out his hand and took the knife. There's no emotion in this scene. He's operating mechanically, and the text is letting us know that. He's just following the instruction. The author is painting a picture of a man acting on impulse without thinking or feeling. Next bullet. The interpretation that we get from biblical commentators on this text is that Abraham was a man of faith. It was faith in God that was being tested, and that's the purpose of the story. But is it? In the beginning of the text, the command to sacrifice Abraham's son was issued by Elohim, the generic term for God or gods worshipped by the Canaanites and the Israelite Confederation prior to the Levites becoming part of Israel. When the sacrifice is about to be performed, the deity that directed the angel to stay Abraham's hand and told him to stop is Yahweh, Yod He Vav He, the unique name for the God of Israel that initiated the Exodus from Egypt. Yahweh, too, will ask for extreme devotion, but this God will never ask for the sacrifice of a child. Next slide, please. So I'm going to read to Kings 2, 26, 27. Kings 2. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not locating it right now. It's a story about the Moabites going to war with Israel, and the king Mesha of the Moabites saw the war was not going well, and Mesha appeals to the Moabite god Chemosh to influence the outcome of the battle by putting his son. Oh, next slide, next bullet, please. Next bullet, yeah. So putting his son on on the wall and burning him to death as a sacrifice, and it turns around the war. So human sacrifice, Moloch worship, was well known to the ancients in the Near East. It had become an integral part of the cultic practices of the Canaanites and Israel prior to the time that the Levites introduced a different concept of God. Next one. Now let's see if I find Jeremiah 32. Okay. Jeremiah was a prophet about the 7th and 6th century BCE. He's talking to God, and I'm going to read this. And God tells him, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too wonderful for me? Surely, thus said the Lord, I am delivering this city to the hands of the Chaldeans and the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And the Chaldeans have been attacking the city and the outcome, and they will burn it down. Okay. For the people and the justifies it, for the people of Israel and Judah have done nothing but evil in my sight since their youth. The people of Israel have done nothing but vex me. Their conduct, declares the Lord. This city has aroused my anger and my wrath from the day it was built, so that it must be removed from my sight, because of all the wickedness of the people of Israel and Judah who have acted so. Their kings and officials, the priests and the prophets, the men of Judah, they have turned their backs on me. They placed their abominations in the house that bears my name, and they built shrines to Baal, which are in the valley of Ben Hinnom, which is just in Jerusalem today. When they offered up their sons and daughters to Moloch, that is the Canaanite god who asked for children to be sacrificed to them, when I had never commanded or even thought of commanding that they should do so, such an abomination, and bring guilt on Judah. So what we know from the text of Jeremiah is that as late as the 7th century BCE, Judeans and Israelites were practicing this form of child sacrifice. And that's the time that this text that I just read to you was written. Next bullet, please. This Moloch worship continued even after the Levites tried to bring the practice to an end. Next slide, please. So the narrative, the story, Yahweh sent an angel to prevent Abraham from striking his son. He says, don't put your hand on the boy and don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God. And Abraham raised his eyes. This new God that influenced Abraham in the story to stay the execution will advocate circumcision to sanctify the covenant, a radical departure from the practices that previously existed in worshiping gods in this part of the world. It was a practice used in Egypt to denote priests. The biblical text on the binding of Isaac, the story I just read about, was from the E source, estimated at 700 to 600 BCE. The prohibitions against this form of worship, called Moloch worship, in the book of Deuteronomy, the same time frame, 700 to 600 BCE. And the book of Leviticus, 600 to 500 BCE. So what we see in terms as a fusion of text to get the Israelites and the Judeans to change their behavior in terms of this practice of Moloch worship, or burning your children to satisfy the gods, a practice that existed all over the Middle East. So what we see in terms of Leviticus, okay, 600 BCE, you shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Moloch, and so proclaim the name of your God. I am the Lord. Any other people or aliens who reside in Israel who give any of their offspring to Moloch shall be put to death. Deuteronomy, do not inquire concerning their gods. Deuteronomy is staged as if this is Moses' departing lecture to the slaves, former slaves, when they reached just outside of Israel. But it was actually written 500 years later as a staging. And Deuteronomy is saying, do not inquire concerning their gods, because their gods are these gods, Els, who are demanding a child sacrifice. The Deuteronomists have Moses saying, I don't want you to do the same. You must not do the same, because every important thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. They would even burn their sons and their daughters in the fires of their gods. So we see a fusion of biblical texts toward the same direction in terms of showing the repugnancy of this practice. And the text I just read about Abraham's close sacrifice of Isaac is really in terms of using a role model that the Canaanites and early Israelites saw as a father figure. So the purpose of the story is to show how the deity Yahweh, who was introduced after the Exodus, differed from the gods that the Israelites had previously worshipped. And Abraham is simply just being used as a role model to demonstrate his faith in God. Moloch worship, which is what child sacrifice was called, was widespread amongst the Canaanites and all of the other tribes in the region in the Middle East. It was believed that the firstborn male child belonged to their deity in the region, must be surrendered by the father, or if the father refused to give it up, the community would take the child from the father, because if that didn't happen, the gods would create terrible things for the members of the community. Next slide, please. So of course, it's not God who requires sacrifice, but man. Thanks. The myth of the narrative testing Abraham was intended to end this barbaric and debilitating practice, replacing it with a harmless ritual, circumcision, and challenge humanity to rethink what they believed to be the truth when they worshiped the Canaanite gods. At the time the biblical author wrote the narrative, stories of Abraham's faith, his heroics, his relationship with deity were well known in Israel, all written by the J scribes. Abraham was used as a character in the author, but used by the author as the role model for bringing an end to this terrible practice that had been prevalent amongst Israelites and other tribes. And it was written by the E scribe 400 to 500 years later. So the near sacrifice of Isaac had an etymological origin to explain the abstention by Israelites from the practice of child sacrifice that was prevailing throughout the region. The purpose of the story is Israel's God, unlike the other deities of the Near East, doesn't want children sacrificed as a means for worship. Sacrificing one's offspring was no longer an act of piety, became a violation of divine law, both in terms of in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and represent a disbelief in Yahweh. The story uses Abraham, the eponymous ancestor of the Israelites, as a role model to establish the precedent for the prohibition of human sacrifice. As Moloch worship subsequently disappeared in the region, ancient interpreters writing in the 5th, 10th century of the Common Era preserved the story, finding a new theme and reinterpreted it as a demonstration of Abraham's willingness to carry out God's commands, even extreme. So it became as a teaching of a demonstration of faith. Whether the meaning of the author intended was understood by the commentators is really unknown, but it was assigned a new meaning, which for many of us were very disturbing. Next slide, please. So now we'll go on to another story that I think you know, and it's called the worship of the golden calf. This, of course, is out of Egypt. So we'll talk about Exodus 32. I'm so wrong. It helps if I got in the right place. Okay, so let me just read the story. I think this is a story that most of us know. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain after the receipt of the 10 Commandments, and God wanted to talk with him further, people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a God that shall go before us. For that man Moses, who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what happened to him." Aaron said to him, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, bring them to me." And all the people took off their gold rings that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he took them and cast them into the fire and made a molten calf. And they exclaimed, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron announced, "Tomorrow shall be a festival of the Lord." Early next day, the people offered up burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. They sat down to eat and drink and then to dance. Next slide, please. Next bullet. Troubling incident. This takes place right after being freed from slavery. And they saw the miracle of the sea, where, according to the text, the sea parted and they were able to pass on dry land. And then the Egyptians who were pursuing them were drowned. They just seen that. And they just had this experience in terms of the receipt of the Ten Commandments. And they saw that God provided a cloud to mark their way, and water was drawn from the rocks for them to drink. And they experienced the victory over this tribe called the Amalekites, who tried to annihilate them. They experienced the divine revelation. Everybody heard God's words. Next bullet. And yet the Israelites violated God's commandment, making and bowing down to a molten image of this golden calf. Next slide. So I asked the question, what does the golden calf symbolize? And I think you know now, it symbolizes Baal. Next bullet, please. So it symbolizes this Canaanite Baal, and they're worshiping this Canaanite god. And Aaron is an active participant in this, in fact, leading it. So the question's got to be raised. How would these groups of people who have been slaves in Egypt and now on the Exodus, who had never been to Canaan, never been to Israel, why would they worship a Canaanite god? Next slide. And Aaron tells them, "This is your God, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." When Aaron saw the discontent, he instructed the people to take off their gold. He built an altar. He announced, "Tomorrow shall be a festival of the Lord." Aaron is a part leading this. An unprejudiced reading shows him as a collaborator, arranging the festivities, failing to restrain the people, allowing them to get out of control. The excuses he offers were those of an ineffective leader. Clearly, in the story, Aaron is portrayed as a guilty party. A passage in the book of Deuteronomy says that God was angry enough to have killed Aaron, but refrained because Moses intervened. Moses is being portrayed as righteous in the story, in contrast with Aaron's sinfulness. Moses came down, and the rest of the story I didn't read. Moses came down, saw what was going on, and I'll just read that. Moses said to Aaron, "What do this people do to you that you have brought such great sin upon them?" And Aaron said, "Let's not be enraged. You know that this people has been evil from the beginning. They said to me, 'Make a god to lead us.' For that man Moses, who brought us from the land of Egypt, we know not what happened to him. So I said to them, this is Aaron speaking, 'Whoever has gold, take it off.' They gave it to me, and I just threw it in the fire, and out came this calf." Moses saw the people were out of control, and since Aaron had let them get out of control, so that they had become a menace to anyone who might oppose them. Moses stood at the gate, said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come here." And who comes forward? It's the Levites. The Levites did as Moses had had bidden, and some 3,000 people were killed by the Levites who had worshipped this golden calf. Okay. So what's troubling about Aaron's behavior? I just read, that's what I just read to you. Okay. He was responsible for the act of apostasy. He shifts the blame. You know these people, how they are bent on evil? Next, please. The calf was formed without building a mold. Aaron simply threw the gold in the fire, and out came this calf. Next slide. Next. What a lame excuse. What does the incident have to say about Aaron's leadership? Not much. Ancient interpreters, again, these are the people who lived in the from 500 to 1500 in the current era, were troubled by these passages. So they invented midrashim, stories, to exculpate Aaron's blame. Next, please. They saw in the story that Hur was missing. And they know at the beginning of the story, Moses tells Aaron he's going back up the mountain. And he tells Aaron and Hur jointly to take charge of the Israelites in his absence. After that, the text makes no reference to Hur in describing the incident, and no further reference to him anywhere in the Bible after that. So an inference that the interpreters came up with is that Hur must have been opposed to the apostasy, and the enraged mob killed him for interfering. Therefore, Aaron, fearing further violence, his own life being threatened, people committing additional sins by taking lives, and his and others, he reluctantly complied. That's the midrashim. Aaron told Moses nothing of Hur's murder and threats against his life, because he thought Moses would execute just judgment against all those who were responsible for apostasy. So Aaron, according to the midrashes, was a man of peace. Didn't want to upset anybody. Seen in this light, he reluctantly complied with the people's wishes to promote peace and harmony. So he was, according to Midrashic traditions, in terms of the stories told about the biblical stories, is that he was a victim of the people who were anxious because of Moses' absence. He tried delaying tactics until Moses would return. When he said, tomorrow will be a festival of the Lord, he was trying to retard the idolatrous impulses of the people. And Aaron, the text tells us, was just a man who hated confrontations, and he did not want to reproach the people. Above all else, he was a man of peace. That's midrashim. Now I'm going to tell you. Let's see. Going to read. Okay. I'm going to read a story from another part of the text that I think you'll see has a profound impact on the story we just read. This is from 1 Kings, and it deals with the period of time following the split between Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So it was after Solomon's death. The northern tribes left for the hill country of Ephraim and take up their own kingdom, build their own kingdom. Jerusalem is in the south. That's where the capital had been. That's where the temple had been. So now I'm going to read to you from 1 Kings 13:35. Jeroboam, he's the king of the north, in terms of Israel, fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. So Jeroboam is now the king of the north of Israel. And he said to himself, now the kingdom may well return to the house of David being in the south. in Jerusalem. If these people still go to offer their sacrifices at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, the heart of these people will turn back to their master Rehoboam, the king of Judah. They will kill me and go back to the king, to King Rehoboam. So the king, this is king, is the northern king, Jeroboam. So the king said, he took counsel, and he made 2 golden calves. Golden calves now, that's the symbol of Baal. And he said to the people, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. And he set up one in Bethel and one in Dan. Okay, now, next quote, please. Jeroboam believed its citizens should not worship in the temple in Jerusalem. So he went to the old Baals and create them as their God. He created 2 shrines at Bethel and Dan. So I just read that. He made 2 golden calves. You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. He says, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Next one. Where have you heard that statement before? Jeroboam understood that the worship of Baal and El remained a continuing part of the culture even after Yahweh was introduced as Israel's God. But Yahweh was being worshipped in Jerusalem. So he wanted to go backwards. And he established a line of priests who were not Levites. And they called themselves, they identified themselves as this line of priests, sons of Aaron, our descendants of Aaron. So scholars believe that the incident in the book of Exodus, we talked about in terms of the golden calf, was really a projection of Jeroboam's sin back to the time of Moses and Aaron, and it was intended to discredit Aaron. Why was the tale created? Because the priests in the north claimed to be descended from Aaron. So they put Aaron front and center in the apostasy in the wilderness by proclaiming tomorrow will be the festival of the Lord, and the calves just came out. And what the story that we read about the golden calf is a story condemning Aaron's family, who are now at least claiming to be the priesthood in the north. So whether they were or not, they claim to be descended from Aaron. Scholars say that it's the priesthood that was appointed by Jeroboam, representing the J source, that represented was descended from Aaron, over the other Levites, claiming that they were descended from Moses. So it poses Moses, who was represented by the E source, as the good guy, and Aaron as the bad guy. The purpose was really of that story to show that priests claiming descent from Aaron were not worthy of leadership because their ancestor failed to provide effective leadership. Now, I told you 3 stories. And I know you're going to tell me it's not the way I heard the story, right? And that's the whole point. The whole point is that we have grown up with these stories, and I've just told you 3 of them. There are many, many others that, because we haven't lost the context in which the stories were created, we lost the original meaning. And so did the ancient scholars from 500 to 1500 who wrote all of the Midrashim. Okay. They didn't know the stories either. So they created an explanation of what the stories meant. And it was very different from what we now believe, or what most scholars now believe, was the original meaning of that story. So that's as far as I'm going to go today. Going to open it up to any questions, comments, alternative stories.
You can raise your hand. You can type in the chat box. So do we have questions for today? Yes, Anita?
I'm interested in how the two stories were brought together. You had mentioned Ezra as being one of the possible people who brought the two stories, the two gods together, the Aaron, the Moses conflict. But it had to take longer in time than one person, right? So how did that work?
Well, first, let's talk about Ezra. Ezra was simply a redactor, an editor. He took the stories from numerous scribes. So Ezra probably wrote very little of any of the stories. So the stories that existed and the stories that I went through today are all from basically from the E source. Okay. And that's what was the purpose of the discussion last week, to show in terms of their various sources based on priestly groups who were also scribes, and they had scribes working for them, and the stories were refined and developed over hundreds of years. Okay, does that help?
And Bob, do you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you. There are two different stories about what happened with Moses coming down from the mountain, and in the second story with Aaron and the golden calf, they hadn't yet been told by God to not have idols because Moses threw down the tablets and they hadn't been read to the Israelites yet. But earlier, the story is God told, they were told to the Israelites en masse.
Well,
that's confusing to me.
Yeah, well, let me see if I can help. The story of the golden calf takes place after the receipt of the Ten Commandments, after Moses has come down from the first, actually several trips up the mountain. And this, according to the J, E, and P sources, the text had been read to them. The D source says no. Okay, but if you just read the biblical text, that the biblical text will tell you that they've already heard 10 commandments. They know they are not to sacrifice to issue sacrifices to other gods other than the God of Israel. So they're aware of that. It's almost a standalone story that's put into the text after the stories of the Ten Commandments. Now, the stories of the Ten Commandments are probably if you read that stories from front to back, is very confusing and very complicated, because there are 4 different stories woven together. We think we know this story because we saw the Charlton Heston make the trip up the mountain and get the commandments, and we saw the storm, and we saw him come down with these 10 commandments. But if you ever really read the text, it is complicated because it's woven. There are 4 separate stories woven together in that text. Okay, try it sometime. Okay.
We have Marilita, but just hold on one second. Barbara Tilton typed in the chat the Jeroboam. She wants, please give the citation, the 2 shrines, Bethel and Dan. It was First Kings.
Let's see. locate it. Okay, it's 1 Kings 12:25.
Okay.
25 through 31.
Okay. And then Carol says, thank you, Sheldon. First time these stories make sense to me. Hope you will continue to teach. That was a
Okay.
comment in the chat. And now, Miralita, did you have a question? And you need to unmute.
I thought the implication was that circumcision then was a covenant to replace child sacrifice. Was that the connection? I mean, I thought way back when Abraham made that covenant about circumcision.
Yeah, you got to remember the stories are put in different places. Okay. Where the story of the sacrifice, the near sacrifice of Isaac, is in the book of Genesis. That would be the earliest stories. So the placement of the stories by the redactor was determined based upon the redactor's understanding of what time period the story occurred to. So if writing a story in the year 500 BCE, but it's a story about the flood, okay? Somebody who now is editing and is going to put all these stories back together is going to put it in the book of Genesis. So it doesn't necessarily fit. Okay.
Oh, you need to unmute yourself again, Miralita.
Thank you for a great series. I hope you will continue with some more lectures.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Do we have some more questions today? Yes, Carol?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I have a trivia question.
That's really good.
When they built the golden calf, Aaron got the gold, the people to donate the gold,
Yeah.
which just kind of made me not feel so sad about all those people that were coming out of Egypt. Where'd they get the gold? And
That's a wonderful question. Okay. These people have been enslaved.
right.
Where are slaves going to get gold? It's a story.
It's a story.
It's a
Okay.
story. It's a
I thought maybe you had an angle for that. Okay.
No.
It's an allegory. I got it.
Yes. Think about, you take it one step further. How do you throw a bunch of gold into a fire and all of a sudden it comes out?
It comes out of
shape? Anybody who knows anything about metallurgy knows that you need to have a mold to shape something.
Right.
You can't just, so it's a story.
All the Bible is true, and some of it happened.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good quote.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Carol.
So this will be, just a note, this will be available it was recorded today. It will be available on our website. I can send everyone, that was participant a copy of the link so that, you can watch it again, or if something comes to mind and after you watch it again, you can send me an email and I can forward it to Sheldon if you don't have his email. And then Bill Livingston has a question. Is there
Okay.
evidence that the Exodus actually took place,
Oh,
and how many people were there?
okay. $1 million question. And it's been obviously been debated. The current thinking is yes, there was an Exodus. There's evidence even in Egypt that would support a Moses being in Egypt. it's really it takes me, when I teach a course, I have taught the course at OLI, and I think Carol may have even taken that course. It takes me 6 2.5-hour sessions to put together the whole story and the proof of it. But to summarize in 2 minutes, yes, there was an exodus. It didn't occur anywhere near the way the Bible says it to occur. In all likelihood, there was only one tribe that made the exodus. Okay, and that was the Levites. Some scholars believe it was also the tribe of Judah that was there, but predominantly the agreement is that there were the Levites were made in. There is a lot of documents in Egypt that refer to people who had been enslaved and escaped, called Shasu, S-H-A-S-U. There is nothing in the Egyptian text that referred to Israelites in Egypt. And that has for centuries thrown people. That's because the Israelites never were there. They were in Canaan. Okay. But there were tribes that ultimately became part of the southern kingdom of Judah that came up from Egypt, according to most scholars. They didn't go to Israel immediately. Okay. They spent a fair amount of time in the exact area where the 10 Commandments are supposed to have come from, and that is in Midian. Okay. So yeah, without going into a 6-week class and to try to tell the story, there was an exodus, in my opinion. Okay.
Alan?
Yeah. Sheldon, my question may not be relevant exactly to today's class, but I'm very interested in the origin of the 3 tribes, which are still very important to the Orthodox. Yet, my mother's uncle was a Kohen. There's the Levites, and then when I learned about all this, I found out I was a common Israelite. So I've been annoyed about that. But what's the origin of those 3 tribes?
The origin of, so tell me again, say that again, Alan. What's the origin of what?
The 3 tribes, the Kohanes, the Levites, and the Israelites.
Okay. So when the northern kingdom was conquered, this was Israel, and they all went to Judah. Okay. What was left of the northern kingdom, God only knows. Okay. So it was the end of when we talk about the 10 lost tribes. The 10 lost tribes are the extinction of what the biblical tribes were, and in terms of some that were had previously been taken off to Assyria. So all that came down and lived in Judah were Judeans, and anybody who came from the north, and the population of Judah doubled or tripled. So we know a lot of northern people during the Assyrian conquest came to Judah, and they were Judeans, one single tribe. The only exception was the Levites. Okay, the Levites have always maintained that distinction because they never had land. They were the priests. At some point in time, and it's believed that it happened during the period of Babylonian exile, a group of priests separated out and said, we are descended from Aaron, and we are entitled to the priesthood. And eventually they got it, and they became known as the Kohens. So they're not really a separate tribe. They're a subset of the Levites, but we treat them as 2 different groups, Kohanes and Levites. But the Kohanes came out of the Levite group. So when we talk about 10 lost tribes, there's 2 tribes. There's Judeans and there's Levites. Does that help?
Okay. I know, like I said, they're still recognizing the Orthodox. They call on the coins first, and then I guess they call the others after that.
Right. In the Orthodox tradition, that there are certain privileges given to the Kohans and also to the Levites. But not
Like
Levites.
I told you,
Pardon me?
my mother's uncle, unfortunately, never had any sons. He had 2 daughters, so his line was ended there. But he would never even go into a funeral. He would sit on a little side room all by himself
Yes.
and not participate in the funeral.
They can't, Kohen technically are not supposed to enter a graveyard, a cemetery. They're not supposed to. No pain.
Okay, thank you.
Don't ask me to explain those traditions.
All right. Well, we are about to end today. If anyone has another question, we can take another question today. And if not, we will close this session for today. And Sheldon will have to talk about some additional programs you may want to do. It seems like this is popular. So thank you everyone for participating today. We appreciate your time and being here. And Sheldon, you did a wonderful job as
Thank you.
always. And we appreciate all the knowledge that you are imparting upon us. Thank you so much.
I want to thank everyone for coming.
It wasn't wonderful, it was spectacular.
Oh, there you
Better than
go.
wonderful. Better than wonderful.
Thank you,
Thank you
Bob.
very
Thank
much.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll
you.
see
Thank
you.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.